Dan had always been curious, especially when it came to his father. At 6 years old, he idolized the man, strong, stoic, always disappearing into the woods behind their home for hours at a time. His father never let him come along on these walks, brushing him off with a gruff, "too dangerous." But today felt different. It wasn't just the summer heat that made the air thick and heavy, something else loomed over the forest. And Dan, with his unyielding curiosity, decided to follow his father. After all, what could be more dangerous than staying behind? The sun was beginning to sink low, casting long, twisted shadows across the treeline. Dan tiptoed behind his father, careful to step where the man stepped, careful not to make a sound. He could hear the crunch of dead leaves beneath his shoes, blending with the distant rustling of branches overhead. The woods felt alive, more so than usual, as if something was breathing deep within their depths. Dan's heart raced with excitement, but a prickling unease began to creep up his spine. He hadn't been this far into the woods before. The air was different here, thick with an earthy, almost metallic scent that clung to the back of his throat. As he pressed on, keeping his father just within sight, something odd caught his eye. There was a flash of movement, quick and silent, far off to his right. He stopped dead in his tracks, straining his ears for the sound of footsteps, but there was only the gentle whisper of the wind. Then he saw it again. It wasn't his father, and it wasn't an animal. The thing, whatever it was, seemed to glide between the trees, pale and translucent like mist. Dan blinked, his small body frozen in place. He wasn't sure if he was imagining it or if something really was there, just beyond the trees watching him. He glanced at his father, now a distant figure moving deeper into the forest, unaware of his son's hesitation. Dan took a deep breath and forced himself to move, his legs trembling with every step. As he passed the spot where he had seen the figure, the temperature dropped noticeably. It was like walking into a freezer, the cold biting at his skin despite the warmth of the day. He felt a presence behind him, so close it made the hair on his neck stand up. "Keep going," he whispered to himself, "keep following Dad." But his legs wouldn't obey. He was rooted to the spot, the cold sinking into his bones. The forest had gone deathly silent. No birds, no insects, just the sound of his own breath, now quick and shallow. And then, slowly, the whispering began. At first it was faint, barely audible, a breathy sound like the wind. But as it grew louder, Dan could make out words, though twisted and wrong. "Dan, come back." The voice was familiar, chillingly so. It was the voice of someone he thought he had long forgotten. Someone from his dreams or maybe his nightmares. He spun around, his chest tight with fear, and there it was. Standing among the trees was the figure from before, its form no longer flickering but fully solid, staring at him. It was a boy, about Dan's age, but with hollow black eyes and skin that seemed to shimmer like water under the moonlight. The boy smiled, a cold, empty expression that sent a wave of dread crashing over Dan. "I've been waiting for you," the ghostly figure whispered. Dan's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit him. He knew this boy. He had seen him before, but only in his darkest dreams. This wasn't just some strange apparition. This was the same boy he had watched drown years ago. The boy who had tried to pull Dan under with him. And now he was back. Dan turned to scream for his father, but his voice caught in his throat. The figure took a step closer, its cold, dead eyes locking onto Dan's. "You didn't save me," the boy hissed, his voice rising with a twisted, angry edge. "Now it's your turn." Dan's body was trembling uncontrollably, his small hands gripping his sides as if trying to hold himself together. He had to move, had to run, but his feet were stuck to the ground as if rooted in place by the same darkness that now surrounded him. The last thing Dan saw before everything went black was the boy's ghostly hand reaching out toward him, fingers curling like talons, ready to pull him into the same cold, watery abyss he had escaped from so long ago. But this time there would be no escape. Don's instincts kicked in. With a surge of panic, he bent down, his small hands clawing at the cold earth beneath his feet. He could feel the moist soil slipping through his fingers, but he grabbed enough of it, not caring about the mud caking under his nails. The boy, the ghost, was getting closer, its black eyes locked on Dan with a hunger that made his skin crawl. Without thinking, Dan hurled the handful of dirt straight at the figure's face. Time seemed to stretch in that moment, and for a brief, fleeting second, he hoped it would work, that somehow this simple, desperate act might be enough to blind it, to stop it. The earth sailed through the air, but something was wrong. It didn't hit with the solid impact Dan had hoped for. Instead, the dirt passed through the ghost's face, scattering like dust through mist. The figure shimmered as if it were nothing but smoke, briefly flickering as if disturbed by the particles. But it didn't scream or stumble back. It barely reacted at all. The ghost blinked, its black eyes narrowing, and for a brief second, Dan swore he saw a flicker of amusement cross its hollow face, a twisted mockery of a smile. The realization hit Dan like a punch to the gut. This thing wasn't solid, it wasn't bound by the same rules as he was. The earth didn't touch it, nothing would. But for just a moment, just one precious second, the boy's head tilted, distracted by the attempt. Dan saw his chance. His legs, once frozen with fear, suddenly sparked to life. He turned sharply on his heel, his heart thudding so loudly in his chest that he could hear it over the eerie silence of the woods. He bolted, sprinting away from the ghost with all the strength his small legs could muster. Each footfall was a thunderclap against the forest floor, pounding through the stillness, as if daring the trees themselves to rise and grab him. The forest rushed past him in a blur, twisting, gnarled branches, tall dark trunks, the low-hanging canopy blotting out what little light remained from the sinking sun. He dodged around trees, leaping over roots and rocks, his breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. Every few steps, his foot would slip on the damp earth, nearly sending him sprawling, but he managed to stay upright, driven by pure terror. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He could feel it behind him, though, even if he couldn't hear it. The coldness, the unnatural bone-deep chill, seemed to follow him like a shadow, nipping at his heels, pulling the warmth from the air as it closed in. Dan's lungs burned, his legs screamed for rest, but he knew he couldn't stop. If he stopped, it would catch him. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the faint snap of twigs underfoot, but it wasn't his father. His father would have called out by now. No, whatever was following him was silent, its steps so unnatural that Dan's own frantic breathing drowned out everything else. The memory of the ghost's face flashed in his mind, those cold, empty eyes, that haunting smile, and worst of all, the way it had whispered his name. Dan, come back. Why was this happening? Why was that boy, that thing, here now after all this time? Dan's mind raced through fragments of memories, piecing together what had happened years ago. He remembered the creek, the way the water had rushed around his ankles, the boy splashing beside him, laughing at first. It had seemed so harmless, just two boys playing near the water. But then the current had taken him. The boy had slipped, and before Dan could grab his hand he was gone. Pulled under, swallowed by the swirling depths. Dan had screamed for help, but no one came. He'd watched helplessly as the boy's face disappeared beneath the water, as the surface rippled and stilled, leaving behind only silence. That was the last time Dan had seen him. Until now. His heart pounded harder as the memory sharpened, and his legs moved faster, fueled by the terror that now threatened to consume him. The woods were dense, the path ahead darkening with every step, but Dan had to keep going. He had to get away, had to reach his father. His father. The thought of him sparked a small flicker of hope. Maybe if he could just find him, everything would be okay. His dad could fix anything. But the forest seemed to stretch on forever, and the cold breath of the ghost was still there, close, too close. Suddenly Dan's foot caught on a root. His body lurched forward, and before he could catch himself, he crashed to the ground. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, and for a moment, everything spun. The world tilted, and the trees above him blurred into dark, towering shadows. Dan groaned, struggling to push himself up, his palms stinging from where they had scraped against the ground. He tried to stand, but his legs felt weak, trembling beneath him. And then he felt it, the cold. It was all around him now, pressing in from every direction, suffocating him. Dan's breath hitched, and he forced himself to his feet, but as he glanced over his shoulder, his heart nearly stopped. The ghost was there, not 10 feet away, standing motionless among the trees, its head tilted to one side, those black eyes still locked onto him. It hadn't chased him, not in the way Dan had expected. It didn't need to. The thing knew he couldn't run forever. It was toying with him, letting him tire himself out, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Dan? The voice came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It echoed through the trees, wrapping around him like a noose, tightening with every syllable. You can't escape. You never could. Dan's legs wobbled beneath him as the full weight of the situation crashed down. He could run, yes, but where? The forest felt endless, an inescapable labyrinth of shadows and whispers. And behind him, the ghost moved forward, slowly, deliberately, taking its time, savoring the chase. Forcing himself to breathe, Dan stumbled forward, his legs threatening to give out. He had to keep going. He had to. The ground was uneven, the thick underbrush slowing his already weak steps. Every sound seemed amplified now, the crunch of leaves beneath his feet, the rustle of branches swaying in the cold, and his own ragged breaths, sharp and desperate. Somewhere, not too far, there had to be an end to the trees. There had to be a clearing or a path or something. But the forest seemed to twist and stretch around him, leading him in circles, pulling him deeper into the heart of its darkness. Dan's mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, the edges of his vision blurring as the panic set in deeper. But as his strength began to wane, the cold tightening its grip, one thought cut through the chaos, clear and piercing. He couldn't outrun it forever. But maybe, just maybe, he could find his father before it was too late. After that, Dan suddenly stumbled and the ghost quickly approached without showing any mercy. After that, no one saw the father and Dan.